My study looks at maternal, infant, and childhood home visitation programs and the association of breastfeeding prevalence in rural and urban communities in New Mexico using 2022 New Mexico PRAMS data. The benefits of breastfeeding for both infants and mothers, also referred to as the dyad, are well studied. Some infant benefits include reduced risk of childhood and adult obesity, reduced risk of allergic disorders like asthma or atopic dermatitis, also known as eczema, improved myofunctional outcomes, improved psychological outcomes, improved gastrointestinal outcomes, and more. For mothers, current research shows those who breastfeed their babies have been associated with reduced frequencies of cardiovascular disease like hypertension, reduced risk of breast cancer, ovarian cancers, and improved postpartum recovery. These and additional factors contribute to influencing the bigger picture of public health. The American Academy of Pediatrics and the World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life, in addition to their solid foods, for up to a year or longer. Because there are so many benefits to breastfeeding, it can seem like an easy choice to make when considering how to feed an infant. However, this is not always the case. Briefly, I just want to mention that not every woman who becomes pregnant and delivers a baby is capable and or willing of breastfeeding, and many factors affect that choice or capacity. The Healthy People 2030 set a goal to have 42.4% of infants exclusively breastfed at 6 months of age. New Mexico exceeded that goal in 2022 by having 62.3% of infants exclusively breastfed at 6 months of age. This is good news, however, there's always room for improvement. New Mexico has relatively high levels of poverty and was ranked the third poorest state in 2023. Half of the state's population live in 3 counties, Bernalillo, Doña Ana, and Santa Fe counties. Much of the state is considered to be rural, and 2/3 of the state is designated as fully or partially health professional shortage areas. Rural communities have been identified as a priority group by the CDC. That is because typically those who live in rural communities have to travel farther to get to healthcare facilities. They might not have as many choices as their urban counterparts. Those that live in rural communities typically have worse health outcomes when compared to the urban counterparts. Practitioners in rural settings might not have access to the most up-to-date trainings and information when compared to urban practitioners. And other factors that rural communities face often are related to limited resources, specifically food deserts and limited access to a variety of healthy and nutritious foods. Related to breastfeeding, previous studies have shown that rural mothers consistently have lower breastfeeding prevalence when compared to urban mothers. Home visitation programs provide resources to new parents. There's robust evidence in the literature that home visitation programs have positive associations with greater breastfeeding uptake. High-quality programs have shown to be beneficial in many categories, and specifically to this study have helped mothers who had previously been at risk for discontinuing breastfeeding. In 2022, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, it was observed that mothers who participated in home visitation programs were at least 2 times more likely to breastfeed when compared to mothers who did not enroll in these programs. It's important to note, however, that the success of the home visitation program is highly dependent on the relationship between the visitor and the parent. Different home visitation programs have different effects in different populations, and it's important to remember that each community is unique and that specific evaluation of New Mexico data is needed. The benefits to the dyad from breastfeeding have implications to prevent numerous health problems that affect New Mexico. New Mexico is below the national average in many key health metrics, including, for example, obesity and obesity-related conditions, and allergic disorders, both of which have the potential to be prevented by increased rates of breastfeeding. There are gaps in the literature specifically related to New Mexico, and this study aims to describe the association between home visitation and breastfeeding prevalence and look at the disparities between urban and rural communities. The dataset I chose to use was from the New Mexico Pregnancy Risk Assessment and Monitoring System, New Mexico PRAMS, or PRAMS for short. This surveys new mothers and is conducted by the New Mexico Department of Health and the CDC. Participants are chosen to create a sample of 100 to 250 participants each month from new birth records. It is mixed methods and uses written responses on a mailed-out survey. If attempts fail to obtain responses, telephone numbers are used and they are called as a secondary method of contact. The database additionally includes birth certificate data, operations, waiting variables, and analytic variables. The survey asks new mothers about their experiences, attitudes, behaviors before, during, and shortly after pregnancy. I used data from 2018 to 2022, which included variables and factors associated with breastfeeding, rurality, and the knowledge of and participation in home visitation programs. To analyze the cross-sectional PRAMS data, I used data from 2022. I used RStudio version 2025.05.01, build 513 from Posit software to run a logistic regression. To ensure more accurate understanding of these associations, I controlled for several potential demographic and socioeconomic confounders that I will later present in Table 1. After creating a subset of the data, I ran bivariate analysis, and I later present both unweighted and weighted data for the prevalence of breastfeeding in the sample and their involvement in home visitation programs. I then generated unweighted odds ratios using logistic regression. These are the variables that I chose to use from the PRAMS database. The primary outcome of interest for my analysis was breastfeeding initiation. The question on the survey reads, did you ever breastfeed or pump breast milk to your new baby even for a short period of time? This was a bivariate outcome, and respondents answered yes or no. I chose not to include duration outcomes due to the fact that this survey is given shortly after birth, and asking how many months the dyad had breastfeed was not applicable. The exposure of interest was participation in home visitation programs. The survey asks about two specific programs, the Healthy Start program and the Family First program, and then additionally it asks about any other type of home visitation program. This is my table 1 where I provide descriptive statistics for the respondents participating in the home visitation programs and who did not participate. The characteristics that were statistically significant were the mother's age, whether the infant was of Hispanic ethnicity, the delivery method of the birth, whether the mother received prenatal care, whether the mother lived in urban or rural setting, and the mother's annual income. In my initial bivariate analysis, I compared mothers who breastfed their infants and participated in the home visitation programs. I hand calculated the prevalence, and in the overall sample, the prevalence of breastfeeding among those who had participated in the home visitation program was 85.8%, and those who had not participated in the home visitation program was 87.5%. The risk ratio for mothers without participation in the home visitation programs was 0.88. However, this value was not significant. The weighted analysis was also ultimately not significant. I then stratified the sample into urban group and rural group. In the prevalence of breastfeeding did look to be higher in the home visitation group in the rural subset. However, when I tested for significance, the p-value was 0.46. I then generated odds ratios from multiple logistic regression. The results indicated that mothers in the sample that were living in rural communities had cesarean births, did not receive prenatal care, had babies of Hispanic ethnicity, and made less than $48,000 annually were less likely to breastfeed. I again stratified and between urban and rural communities, and the significant difference in factors, there didn't seem to be a significant difference in the factors. Here I highlight that those that had lower odds of breastfeeding were those that lived in rural communities, had C-sections, and did not have prenatal care. Those that had higher odds of breastfeeding were the non-Hispanic ethnicity infant dyads and an annual income above $48,000 annually. However, a major assumption of logistic regression is rarity. Breastfeeding initiation is a common outcome, and in New Mexico, even considering issues of significance. Given more training and time, I could yield better results using a modified Poisson regression or negative binomial analysis. These, however, are slightly outside the scope of this assignment. I can confidently report that mothers that participated in home visitation programs did tend to be younger, and in the initial unweighted stratified rural sample, it showed mothers that participated in home visitation programs did have higher prevalence of breastfeeding. However, again, this metric was not statistically significant. Some things I want to talk about, things to consider. I found that home participation in home visitation programs, as measured by this study, was not significantly associated with increased uptake of breastfeeding. And when looking at the descriptive statistics in the overall sample, it is apparent that mothers that participated in the home visitation programs were consistently in the at-risk categories. These results signify to me that there is more complexity to this association to explore given more time and resources. Some limitations that I encountered in my survey that I wanted to talk about was that I used cross-sectional data and I cannot establish temporality with this study. In a perfect world, I'd like to mitigate this by having more time and resources to collect my own prospective data. This would allow me to have better quality control, and with prospective data, I would be able to establish temporality and causation. Different home visitation programs may focus on different types of outcomes, and it's important to note that in the New Mexico PRAMS survey, it asks about the 2 specific home visitation programs, but that third option that says any other type of home visitation programs does not give me the full insight to which types of programs the mothers participated in. Due to the large abundance of evidence in the literature that suggests that participation in home visitation programs is positively associated with greater uptake of breastfeeding, it's reasonable to say there are confounding factors affecting these results that I would like to consider at a later date. While New Mexico consistently meets or exceeds national goals aimed at increasing breastfeeding, it's important to consider the differences between urban and rural communities. And continue to improve the health of the state. More research is needed to more clearly understand what factors of home visitation may be positively associated with breastfeeding prevalence in New Mexico, specifically in the rural communities. In conclusion, breastfeeding is important, and with better understanding of specific home visitation programs and working with communities to understand their specific culture and needs, tailored home visitation programs may be a way to increase breastfeeding uptake. While the results of my study did not necessarily support my hypothesis, this study does contribute to the broader topic of maternal child health interventions specific to New Mexico. The findings suggest that the relationship between home visitation and breastfeeding may be more complex than initially expected. Continued research is needed to clarify these dynamics, evaluate program implementation, and identify which components of home visitation are most effective in supporting breastfeeding success. Through this process, I have learned a lot, and in the future, given more time and resources, I would like to consider further research at a later time. Thank you so much.